How's it going, everybody? Today we are going to work on a project and basically mimic a piece of furniture that's sold online for a hefty price of around $600. For the price of these two pieces of lumber, we're looking at a 4x6 and a 2x4, right around $31, $32, give or take, depending on taxes or where you live. These two pieces here are going to be a replica of what's sold online for $600 for the price of $31. Everybody's been to that store and seen something that they want to have because it looks great, and they look at the price tag and it's just ridiculous. I'm going to show you how I would accomplish this task with just these two pieces of wood. Let's see what we can do. So what we want to start with is cross-cutting our 4x6s on the miter saw. And the reason you want to use a miter saw, it's going to give you the most accurate cut as opposed to a circular saw. So I'm going for a 3-foot board here. I'm going to make my measurement of my marking at 3 feet. However, I'm going to cut over the 3-foot mark. I definitely don't want to cut under the 3-foot mark, but the reason I want to cut over and not right on the 3-foot mark is because when I glue up two 4x6s together, at the end, I want to be able to clean up one cut on one side and then make my marking for the 3 feet on the opposite side and finish off with a nice flush cut as well. If I were to cut my 3-foot mark at this initial cut, I wouldn't have enough to play with at the end to clean up the final dimension and the final edges. This is the reason why you want to cut beyond whatever your final length is going to be, and you'll see me do this throughout the project. After cutting my first 4x6, I'm going to rough measure the second 4x6 and continue the same process, making sure that I'm cutting over my final dimension. You may wonder why I like to score the 4x6 or any piece of wood that I'm cutting before I go through the final depth. The reason behind it is because it reduces tear out. If you score your first cut, you have less tear out. So here are my two 4x6s side to side. What I want to find is the grain pattern for the edges. I want to make it look like some sort of design. With both these cut pieces coming from the exact same wood, I could find a decent design to put on the edge. If you're not paying attention to this portion so much, you may come out with something that you're not going to like in the end result. The next step that I'm taking is cutting the 2x4 to length. Now again, I'm not going for my final length here, I'm going for over my final length so that I have some room to play with when I have to make the final cuts. Everybody has the option to custom make their own size bench. I found that somewhere between 15 to 18 inches for the legs is a sufficient size and length for legs. It all depends on where you're placing the bench, who you're building it for, and what you're planning on doing with it. For a clear understanding of the length of the legs that I'm building here, mine are going to be 18 inches. Okay, so what I'm about to do right now, is this completely necessary to build a bench? The answer is no. In order to build a bench, do I need a jointer and a planer? Again, the answer is no. I like to use these tools throughout my projects to flatten out and make boards even. You can still build a very nice bench without the use of these tools. It's going to require some sanding, some more handwork, and even if it's uneven in certain places, sometimes that's the way the piece should look. If you are building this project with the use of a joiner, always make sure that your fence is at 90. When you move the joiner, you use the joiner, you never know what could happen. Before using it again, just always verify that your fence is at 90 and that way your cuts come out clean.
So the first step that I'm taking with using my jointer on the first piece of board here is face jointing. I want to make sure that the face of this piece of wood is flat enough to be able to push against the fence to get a nice square edge. And just a quick safety tip, always use push blocks no matter what size board you're using. Unless it's an enormous board where you can put your hands safely on top and push through, always use your push blocks. A couple additional tips to using a joiner. If you haven't used your joiner in a while, just rub a little bit of paste wax on both the infeed and the outfeed table to have a nice smooth run with each board passing. If you use it on a continuous basis, you may still have some of the old paste wax built up on there, which your board's still running smooth enough. If you start to feel it getting a little bit rough on the push, just go ahead and rub some of that paste wax on both sides and you'll feel a huge difference in each push. So I don't take my boards down any more than 1/8 of an inch throughout each pass. That is the reason why you see me passing the board multiple times, because I do not want to take off more than 1/8 of an inch throughout each pass. One tip that I can give you is to make sure that when you're pushing through on each board, your outfeed is where you want to put your weight towards. Your infeed portion, which is in front of the blade, you want to just go ahead and guide the board in the direction towards the outfeed table. However, you want to maintain pressure on the outfeed table while the board is passing through. So after face joining the 4x6s, I'm going to do both pieces. I'm going to go ahead and set it up, the one portion that I face jointed against the fence, and I'm going to go ahead and edge joint this 4x6. Once I'm done edge joining this 4x6, it is ready to go to the planer. Alright, step 3 of 4 in flattening a board is the use of a planer. So if you remember us face joining the board on the joiner itself and then edge joining the board, for each piece of wood you are passing through the planer, you want to make sure that face jointed portion is flat against the infeed and outfeed table of the planer. So what the planer is doing is creating a parallel side to the face jointed side you created on the joiner. If you were to run the face jointed side upwards towards the blades of the planer, what you had accomplished on the joiner would have been pointless, because now it's creating a parallel side to an uneven and basically non-flat piece of wood. And you might as well have just started without face joining anything. So if you are using a planer, just make sure you stay up with the user manual. Understand your tool that you're using. Know whether or not switching from the numbers 1 to 2 for dimensional cutting, if whether or not the machine has to be functioning at the time you adjust that switch, or could it be off? These are things that you need to know. Each rotation of the wheel, am I going 1/16 of an inch? For a quarter turn, am I going 1/8 of an inch, 1/16 of an inch, 30/2 of an inch? Understand what your machine is capable of doing so that you know how to better your projects. Okay, here are the 2x4 pieces all cut and sized, step 3 of 4. 2 faces and 1 edge. Now we need to head over to the table saw to finish the 4th and final step. There are a couple steps I need to take before I make my cut. I want to make sure the edge that I used against the joiner is what's going to be placed against the fence of the table saw. As I'm raising my table saw blade based on the thickness of the wood, I want the gullet to be on top of the wood, not the tip of the blade. The gullet is that U-shaped portion that's between the teeth. So the bottom portion where that U is based out on, I want that portion to be above, if not even, with the wood. Now, in order for me to get 2 even pieces of wood out of this one piece of wood, I want to make sure that whatever the middle portion is of this wood, I cut one piece shorter or thinner than the other piece that's going to be extra. And the reason I want to do that is because when I pass the second portion through, I want to be able to have enough wood to take off. Keep in mind, a saw blade is right around 1/8 of an inch, so make sure you give yourself at least 1/8 of an inch on the outside cut. In addition to using the table saw, whatever is between the saw blade and the fence is the piece that you want to keep. You don't want to cut a piece between the saw blade and the table saw and throw that piece to the side. That is supposed to be your good piece. Whatever you're cutting between the blade and the fence, that's the piece that you want to have measured out, and that's the piece that you want to keep. Now I know I may get some comments in regards to how I'm picking up this piece of wood by reaching over the table saw blade. I understand that the best way and safest way to do this is to push the piece of wood through and grab it from the other side, especially when you have your blade off. However, I have been using this table saw for many years now, and I know it's hard to see how my body is moving, but I'm actually moving to the left of the blade rather than reaching over. However, it's still an unsafe way to do it, and I recommend still turning your table saw blade off and getting the piece on your outfeed table once it passes through. So here are the 2x4 pieces, all identical except for the length. The length is going to be cut using the miter saw at 5 degrees. As you can see, I adjusted my miter saw to 5 degrees, and I'm going to cut each board on one end only, at 5 degrees. The angle of your legs are completely up to you on how you want them to look. I wouldn't pass 10 degrees on a leg. However, I would go anywhere between 5 to give or take 7 to 8 degrees on a cut, depending on the angle style you want for your legs. So right after the final cut of the fourth leg, I want to show you what it's going to look like standing up. We need to still make one 5-degree cut on the very top for the actual bench to sit on flat. However, you have to pay close attention to how this angle is going to be cut. It's not going to be cut the same direction as you were cutting on the miter saw. It's actually going to cut the opposite direction on a 5-degree cut. And that is what's going to give you a flat top portion for each leg so that the bench portion can lay down flat. Typically, if I was doing this without a video, I would flip the board on the same 5-degree cut, and that way I can get the other cut the opposite direction. However, I want to show you what it's like to adjust your miter saw to the opposite 5-degree, and all you have to do is make sure that the cut that you initially made is going to be against a stop block. This stop block will allow all 4 boards to be cut at the same exact length. If I'm cutting at 18 inches, each board is going to be cut at 18 inches with the use of a stop block. If I were to have cut my final cut a 1/16 of an inch below my mark, my final cut that I wanted to make, well, each board is going to be a 1/16 of an inch below based on the placement of the stop block. So you want to make sure that you cut these one at a time. Do not attempt to cut them all at the same time. The reason is you don't know if your stop block is off by a 1/16 of an inch on its way down towards your arm. So make sure that you clean up the dust particles between the board and the stop block itself. The dust particles can create a difference of length if it's pushed between the board and the stop block. So again, what I'm doing here is cutting each piece at its final length with the use of the stop block. If you don't have a setup the way I do here with a track system for a stop block, just use clamps. It works just the same. And here are the legs showing standing up with the flat portion on top at 5 degrees and the angle portion on the bottom at 5 degrees. So here is the fourth and final step for flattening this board, the 4x6, on all sides. we want to make sure that the blade is around, if not a little bit above, half the thickness of the board. And the reason we want to do this is because we do not want to run the blade all the way up on a piece so big. We want to use the blade to cut half the thickness of the board. Once it passes through, we'll pull the board back, we will flip it, but we will keep the same side against the fence to give us our final clean cut on one edge. Notice how slow I am pushing this board through. Remember, this is a thick board, so we want to make sure we're giving the blade its time to work and cut its way through the thickness. Make sure that you keep your hands safe distance from the blade itself. I use my hand, my left hand, as a feather board for the table saw. Just keep in mind, pay attention, and always be cognizant of where that left hand is at all times. So as you can see, I had flipped the board and we're cutting the second half of one side in order to have a nice clean cut. When you're done, you should have something very flimsy like this, if not just some dust particles that you cleaned up. And now it's time for the final edging on the last board. We want to make sure that we follow the same steps as before. That way everything gets done the same exact way and there aren't any issues you're running into. So if you made it this far through the video and you're following along with the project, you should feel pretty proud of yourself based on the fact that the next step is the glue up. So during any glue up projects, there's only two glues that I use and it's only one brand, it's Titebond, and I use Titebond 2 for all my construction projects, but I use Titebond 3 if I'm making anything like a cutting board that has to do with continuous use of water basically. If there's water that's always going to go against a project, it's going to be Titebond 3. If it's a construction project, it's going to be Titebond 2. Even though Titebond 2 is still water resistant, Titebond 3 is meant for actual projects that come in contact with water continuously. So here we have both our 4x6 pieces together. They are cut to the same dimensions, they are the same thickness, and they are ready to get glued up. Now these two boards are not clamped or glued yet. However, if for whatever reason you find yourself having a seam that still has some sort of gap between, I'm going to show you a trick during this project on how to accomplish a seamless joint. The next step in this project is creating the cut that goes between the legs and under the base portion of the bench top. Understand what kind of hangover you want and the thickness of the legs together. Take that into consideration before you make your cut. Because my legs were cut at 5 degrees, I need to make sure that the inner brackets are also cut at 5 degrees. So as you can see here, I'm cutting one edge at a 5-degree cut. I'm going to make a measurement for what I feel is going to work for this bench. The measurement I'm going to take, I'm not going to cut its final length on this cut. I'm going to cut over this cut so that when I put it on the stop blocks later with another cut, both will match up perfectly with each other. Pay close attention to the way your blade lays on this board so that each cut is made opposite of each other. So if you do not want to keep readjusting your miter saw, this is the technique that I use in order to accomplish both cuts. Once you cut one edge at 5 degrees, you can simply turn the board the other way and you can cut your other 5-degree mark. This makes the process go a lot quicker. And here I am using the stop block on the opposite side of the miter saw. It does not matter to which side you use it on as long as you're using the stop block to make these cuts. So with the top portion being done of the legs, the top cut, as you can see, 5 degrees on both sides is going to create 5 degrees for the entire leg all the way around. We have 5-degree cuts on the bottom of the feet, we have 5-degree cuts on the top for the base portion of the bench top, and we have 5-degree cuts for the inner bracket that goes between the legs. This is what I'm showing on this side, is make sure that you are actually placing the 5-degree cut in the right direction. If you don't place your 5-degree cut in the right direction, your legs will turn inwards instead of outwards. And now that we have this step complete, we need to make another bracket that goes between the two legs on both sides. This step is completely up to you, the length, the view, the look, however you want to see it. It's as easy as moving your tape measure up and down to figure out the length that you want for this inner bracket. With that being said, I already have a cut, a 5-degree cut on one of these boards. And the reason I have a 5-degree cut on one of these boards is because I already used that cut for a different portion of the project. So I want to make sure that whatever my length is going to be, I am still cutting over my measurements. And that way I can use the stop block to cut both pieces exactly the same length. So the steps taken in this portion of the project is making sure that your stop block's tight. However, also making sure that the edge of that stop block and what's between that and the blade is your actual cut. Also make sure that the angle that's against the stop block is opposite of what you are going to be cutting. Not every bench you build is going to have angled cuts in order to make the legs appear at an angle. However, learning these techniques, if you want to build any bench that has legs at angles, it's the same exact process no matter which bench you're building. If you're going to make straight legs, you don't need to make angled cuts, but the process is the same without the 5 degrees. And here I am sliding the final cut into the legs. Keep in mind, you want to make sure that you have some sort of measurement. Even though they are exactly identical with each other, you still want to have some sort of measurement on the legs, and that way you're not guessing to where this final cut is going to sit. I have learned the hard way when not laying down paper or anything below any sort of clamp and glue up. The reason I'm laying down paper here is because if glue happens to run beyond the clamps, which I guarantee it will, it's going to get stuck on the concrete. Cleaning glue from surfaces is not hard, it's just a matter of scraping it. However, it really depends on what you are gluing up on, whether it be a tabletop, concrete, outside, some sawhorses. It all depends on what you are using. It's always best to put some sort of barrier between your glue up and the surface you're gluing up on. Many times throughout projects, I do like to flatten the glue on the edge, whether I'm using a brush or a card of some sort. That way I get an even spread across. This is sufficient enough for the type of project we're doing here, based on the fact that the squeeze out that's going to occur during the clamping process, it's going to be enough to hold these two pieces together. The clamps that I'm using here are called parallel clamps, and the function of parallel clamps is to create an even bottom portion of whatever you're gluing up. The bottom portion of these parallel clamps are creating a flat surface. I use these for cutting boards, for tabletops, for anything that needs to have some sort of flatness or as close to flat as possible. If you're using bar clamps to complete this task, don't be surprised if you have some sort of unevenness between the seams. If you are going to use bar clamps in a glue up for some sort of surface that needs to be flat, make sure you use the bar clamps on the top, but keep the parallel clamps on the bottom. Once you have your clamps clamped to pressure, you're going to get glue squeeze out. Glue squeeze out is good. It's showing that there's enough glue between the seam in order to maintain its hold. Cleaning glue squeeze out is super easy. All it requires is water and a rag. You want to make sure you complete this before the glue dries. If you don't clean the glue during glue squeeze out, it's going to be very hard to clean once it dries. It's going to leave rock hard chunks on the wood. It's not impossible to remove, but it does take extra work, which would be unnecessary if you just completed this task as the glue squeeze out occurred. Okay, the next step is gluing the legs together. The clamps that I'm using for this glue up are called F-clamps. F-clamps are light duty clamps and they work tremendously when it comes to light duty joints. And just as before when we had glue squeeze out for the bench top, you're going to get glue squeeze out for the joints of the legs as well. What you don't want to have is a lot of glue squeeze out on the legs. And when I say a lot, that means completely dripping down the legs. That's just a waste of glue. Not that you can't clean it up, but you're using more material than actually needed. So I will give this a complete day to dry up. If you start messing with it as soon as you're done gluing, get ready for them to separate. The next day I removed the boards from the clamp and I'm getting ready to cut the edges of the bench top. The process in this is cleaning up one edge, making sure that's nice and flat and flushed with each other, turning the board and cutting your final dimension, which is going to make it 3 feet for me, and it's going to have a nice final and flushed edge. This is the reason why my initial cut was over 3 feet, so I had enough room to do this. And as you can see, after I make my final cut, here is my 3-foot bench top. The next step I'm going to take is an additional structural step. I can easily place these legs on the bottom of the bench and call it a day. However, what I do not want to have happen is what's called racking. If you can imagine 2 pieces of wood standing straight up and moving side to side, that's what's called racking. We want to avoid that happening, especially on a bench. If I were to place these legs on the bench, screw them in, and end up walking away, there's a chance that that could happen. I need to add an additional brace between the 2 legs in order for that to not occur. So if you remember the long piece of the 2x4 that we had cut, we planed, we jointed, we flattened out, and we made it the same size as all the pieces of the leg, that's what we're going to use for the brace that goes between both legs. I'm going to create a joint of somewhat similar to a half lap joint. What a half lap joint is a portion of a wood cut out against another portion of a wood cut out and placed together. A butt joint is as easy as putting the piece of wood against the edge of another piece of wood and screwing it in. I want to avoid the structural integrity of this frame with just the use of a screw. So as you can see, I measured out the thickness of the wood, the brace that's going to go from one side to the other. The next step I'm taking is finding somewhat middle of the thickness of the top bracket between the legs. This does not have to be exact, it just has to be somewhat close. Once I find that measurement, I'm going to use dado blades. Dado blades are blades that are together and they create a bigger cutout. We can go as big as 3/4 of an inch on my table saw with a dado stack, and that is the reason to why I want to use this, is because of the fact that I'm going to be cutting out more wood. You can easily complete this task with a standard table saw blade. It's just going to require a lot more passes. The process for completing this task is making sure that whatever blade you're using, the top tooth is lined up with the measurement that you made. It's as easy as continuing the passes until each edge of the blade touches and cuts out each edge that you made for the thickness of the bracket that goes across. This is not a standard cut that you use on a table saw. You're using a thick blade here, a dado stack. The blades are wide, so make sure that your hands are away from the blade at all times. And here I am cutting the final length of the bracket that goes between the legs. This piece is cut at 90 degrees, basically your zero mark on your miter saw. It is not cut at 5 degrees. What I want to show you here is the cutout for the half lap joint. As you can see, we're placing this piece into the groove that we made on the table saw with the dado stack. What you're going to see is the amount of wood that needs to be cut out. It appears that this portion is what needs to be cut out. However, it's actually where I made the X. Once I remove this portion from the groove that we cut out, you're going to see how much wood actually needs to be cut. It's not the portion that fits in the groove, it's the opposite side of what's left over. Once we have this measurement, we're going to go back to the table saw. We're going to use either the dado stack or the standard table saw blade, and we're going to raise the top tooth until we get to our measurement. This is the height and the measurement that you made for your half lap joint. When cross-cutting a half lap joint, you want to make sure that you're using a miter gauge. You do not want to use the fence of a table saw in order to complete this task. You definitely don't want to use a miter gauge and a table saw fence at the same time. That's going to create what's called binding, and you're going to get what's called kickback. What you're seeing here is the half lap joint cut out on one side. If done correctly, you're going to have this result. And obviously verifying that the half lap joint fits tight and in the groove as it needs to be with flush to the top. This is exactly what I'm looking for, and this is how I wanted the joint to come out. Now that we have seen how to accomplish this joint for one leg, we need to do it for the opposite side as well. I'm going to go ahead and make my marking of where I want the blade to stop. The height of the blade should be exactly the same as the first cut, as we have made the grooves the same on the dado stack. Once we have this measured out, it's ready to go back to the table saw, and with the use of the miter gauge, we're going ahead and cut this half lap joint. Just take your time, keep your hands away from the blade, and make sure that the blade is lined up with the end mark for your half lap joint. Using a miter gauge, you want to place your hands over the miter gauge and pull towards the miter gauge as you're guiding the wood towards the blade. You do not want to push against the blade. You want to allow the miter gauge to complete the task. And now that we have both half lap joints cut, they're going to fit nicely into the brackets of the legs, and we're going to be ready for glue up as well as a screw to go on top. So here is your structured base without glue and 2 screws for each side. So I removed this piece to go ahead and place glue on the half lap joints. This is what's going to create a strong bind between the joints. I'm also going to add 1 screw to each side to create additional strength. If you complete it this way with glue and a screw, you do not need to wait for the glue to dry up to move to the next step. You also don't need to use clamps. This final step is as easy as making a pilot hole between the half lap joints and screwing in a screw. As mentioned earlier in the video, I wanted to show you a trick on how to create a seamless joint. When you have extra sawdust from your cuts, and make sure you're using the same sawdust from the wood that you were cutting, keep that sawdust for any time you need to create a seamless joint. I'm going to create some sort of paste with glue and sawdust. I like to place some sawdust into the crevice, basically the seam of the joint, prior to adding glue. That will fill in the joint similar to what caulking does. Once I put the second layer, which is glue, I'm going to go ahead and add additional sawdust to the top of that glue layer. That's going to create the color, and that's going to give the seam a seamless look. This is the reason why you want to use the same sawdust from the piece of wood that you cut. That way it blends in naturally. And of course, just like every project, sanding is required. Sanding's not always the most fun portion of the project, but it is a requirement. So I'm going to go ahead and sand everything up to 120 grit. Now you have a couple options when creating a profile for this bench top. I wanted to go with a round over. However, I didn't want to use my router and make it appear as it came out of a machine shop. I wanted to create a natural wood look. In order for me to do that, I needed to hit the corners with my orbital sander. This is what's going to create a round over on the corners, but also give it a natural look. You'll see what I mean once I show you the edge. So here is our square edge that has not been rounded over, and here is our corner that has been rounded over. And as you can see, it gives it a natural look. After all the corners have been rounded over and the sanding is complete, it is now time for the final steps of completing this bench. I'm going to create some pilot holes throughout all the brackets that are going to attach to the bench bottom. I am then going to add some drops of glue. I am not going to spread this across tremendously, it's just enough to give it additional strength. Once I do this, I'm going to flip this base portion back onto the bottom portion of the bench. I'm going to make my measurements so that each side is evenly spaced out for a nice hangover, as well as where the legs are sitting. I want to make sure that the legs are exactly the same on both sides to have an even hangover. I always like to add one screw only prior to making my final adjustments. This is what gives me the ability to maneuver the legs left or right in order to make sure that they are still even. The first screw goes towards the middle of the base, and this is what's going to give me the ability to maneuver the legs if anything got out of alignment. Once I know that everything is still set, or if I need to make any adjustments, I will take care of that and then move on to screwing in the remainder of the screws. In case you're wondering what kind of screws I'm using, I like to use deck screws for all my projects. They add additional strength and they are super easy to use. And here we have our unfinished raw bench. Everything on this bench is complete up to the point of how you want the color to come out. I am going to place a natural look on this because I want to keep the natural color of the pine. So I'm going to use shellac and I'm going to use some polyurethane. Shellac is what gives wood a natural look. It's not going to change the color of the wood, it's going to give it a different shade. And as you can see, as I'm spraying, it's giving it a darker but yet more alive look. And that's the look that I'm going for. If you were going to paint this project and you wanted the bench top to be a different color than the legs, I would highly recommend painting the legs and the bench top completely separate and completely unattached from each other. That's what's going to give you the cleanest paint look. Once both the base and the top are completely painted and dried, then you can attach the base to the bench top. If completing this project as I am with the use of shellac and polyurethane, if you're looking for that natural color, polyurethane is going to be a protective coat. It's going to allow this bench to be protected throughout the years. I am just using wipe-on polyurethane. They also sell this in spray cans. Whatever you desire on using, that's your choice. And here is our completed bench. I know it was a process, however, this bench is well worth it, especially for around $30. You can give this as gifts to people for birthdays, Christmas, whatever holidays that you celebrate. This bench right here will make it in anybody's home. I hope you enjoyed this process and I thank you for watching and staying along with me this entire time.